Greetings and welcome to this first mini lecture on the British parliamentary system. Your book starts out by talking a bit distinguishing between parliamentary systems, and I will use Great Britain as my example, and presidential systems. I'll use the United States as my example. In a presidential system like the United States, of course, the president is elected independently of the Congress. The president has a different term of office than the Congress, right? A president is elected for a 4-year term, the House for 2 years, the Senate for 6 years, and the people elect them completely separate. In Great Britain, the people do not directly elect the prime minister, and your book points that out. Although I do think that your book is a little bit misleading because in reality, British elections have turned more and more into presidential type elections. Everyone knows that depending on which party wins the election, who the new prime minister will be. In recent decades, there has been more and more attention placed on the individual who will become the new prime minister. So even though your book points out that it is true that the prime minister is elected by the House of Commons, that the prime minister has the same term of office as the members of the Commons, and in fact, the prime minister is a member of the House of Commons. I do think it is fair to point out that the British prime minister over time has begun looking a lot more like a president. For example, prime ministers spend a lot less time in the House of Commons than they used to. But that is a discussion for my comparative politics class or global politics class. If any of you become interested in British politics, I would encourage you next semester to take global politics from me. Your notes point out 5 overviews, and I'll discuss them a little bit, although I want to try to make the discussion a bit more comparative in the mini lecture. The first is parliamentary supremacy. That's the first overview in your notes. And I would compare that with constitutional supremacy in the United States. In the United States, the Constitution is the supreme law of the land. On several occasions, the Congress has passed a law, and it has been struck down by the U.S. Supreme Court as unconstitutional. The Constitution is seen as superior to ordinary acts of the Congress, and there I'm quoting John Marshall, who I will talk about in the next module, or 2 modules from now when we get to judiciaries. In Great Britain, there is no single document they call a constitution. There are written documents that kind of are like mini constitutions, the Magna Carta, the Act of Union, the Parliament Acts of 1911 and 1949. But there is not a single codified document that they would call the Constitution in Britain. And therefore, if the House of Commons, which is usually called the Parliament, if they pass a law, it is by its very nature legal or constitutional. So that is a huge difference with no formal written constitution in Britain versus a formal constitution in the United States. So parliamentary versus constitutional supremacy would be, I think, the first major distinction between these governmental systems. The second one is Great Britain has a unitary system, and the United States has a federal system. I don't think that it is really appropriate to say whether one is superior or not. Your notes point out that a lot more countries look like Great Britain. About 90% of countries in the world are unitary. About 10%, it's a little bit over 10%, but I'm rounding down a little bit. About 10% are federal. like the United States. I think the better question is a unitary or federal system appropriate for the country being discussed? For example, there is no question in my mind that federalism makes sense in the United States. And what I mean by federalism is that regional governments, which we call states in the United States, states derive their authority not from the national government, but from the Constitution. In a unitary system, there are also regional and local governments, but those regional and local governments get their power from the national government. And of course, the danger of the national government giving you power is that under certain circumstances, the national government may take it away. For example, if you go online, there's a lot of articles talking about how in recent years in Great Britain, regional governments in Scotland and in Wales, for example, have engaged in what they call devolution. That is to say, that the national government has granted more power to these regional legislatures. And in fact, I've run across a couple sources saying that this looks a lot like quasi-federalism, or looks more and more like the United States. And I always pause and I always have a problem with this. And the problem, of course, is that yes, it is true that London in recent years has given more power, more authority, more autonomy to places like Scotland and Wales and Northern Ireland. The problem with that, though, is that that authority is granted by the central government and can be taken away. In the case of the United States, the states do have certain powers that are guaranteed by the Constitution. Now, in reality, the greatest problem for states in the United States is they're very dependent on the national government for money. And so the national government does, in the case of the United States, have a stranglehold on the states. This is very different than in, say, a country like Germany, where in Germany the Constitution guarantees the states, which they call land or lander governments in Germany, an equal proportion of tax revenue with the national government. So the states in Germany are much more financially independent and have more power than American states do. So it isn't really fair to just say whether a country is unitary or federal. How federal is the country? And certainly Germany and Canada would be two examples of states with a lot more independence from the national government than our states have. The third distinction in your notes is the distinction between a fusion and separation of powers. I talked earlier in the mini lectures about separation of powers, that in the United States, the executive and the legislative branches are different in a whole variety of ways. They represent different constituencies, they have different terms of offices, and they have ways to check and to balance one another. In the United States, for example, a person can only serve in one institution at a time. So if you are a congressperson, you cannot be a federal judge. If you are the president, you cannot also serve in the Senate. But in Britain, because of fusion of powers, the prime minister, for example, is head of both the executive branch and the legislative branch at the same time. The prime minister's cabinet secretaries are also members of the British House of Commons. In the United States, that is explicitly forbidden. The president's cabinet cannot hold any other office, so you cannot have a congressperson serve in the president's cabinet because of separation of powers. So there is a distinction between fusion of powers and separation of powers. Obviously, in a fusion of power model, legislation is probably going to be passed easier, and we'll talk about that later on, probably in the second mini lecture. The fourth overview that I pointed out was collective responsibility. This exists in Britain. It does not exist in the United States. I'll talk about collective responsibility a lot more when I talk about the Prime Minister versus the President when I get to executives. But one of the key features of the British system is that they practice this tradition called collective responsibility. So when the Prime Minister and the Cabinet Secretaries meet, they argue, they disagree about policy behind closed doors. But when the Prime Minister goes public and announces that the government's position on a piece of legislation is this, everyone publicly supports the Prime Minister. And this is one of the reasons why prime ministers often choose rivals in their party, people who disagree with them, because people want to be in the cabinet, because in Britain, really the only place that you are going to rise up and become prime minister is if you become a cabinet secretary first. It is kind of a rite of passage. The only way to the top in the British system is to serve in the House of Commons, then be a junior cabinet secretary, then be a cabinet secretary, then become prime minister. This is obviously very different in the United States, where someone like Donald Trump had no government experience at all and became president. He's obviously not the only one. Dwight Eisenhower, for example, had been a general, had no government experience, and became president. This has been true of several generals in American history. President Grant comes to mind. Or you can come from the House of Representatives. That was Abraham Lincoln's only federal experience before becoming president. Or a senator like Barack Obama or John Kennedy, or a vice president like George Bush Sr., for example, or a governor. And I actually think that to become an American president, the best single experience you can have is to be the governor of a large urban state like California or New York or Texas or Florida. And you see examples of governors. Ronald Reagan was a governor before he became president. Bill Clinton was a governor before he became a president. Jimmy Carter was a governor before he became president. And so there you go. There are multiple roads to the top in the United States. There's only one road to the top in Britain. And so people are willing to hide their disagreements in order to have a bite at the apple. The last overview that I want you to know is that Britain has what I call a 2+ party system. And when I ask you on the exam, according to Randall, Britain has what? A 2+ party system versus a really tight two-party system in the United States. And what I mean is, if you take a look at the U.S. Congress, people are Democrats or Republicans. Yes, there's the occasional independent, like Bernie Sanders, for example, or Angus King of Maine. But in Britain, there's really a 2+ party system. You should know the two largest parties. I will put that in the test bank. You should know Labour and Conservative are the two major parties. But there are also a lot of regional parties represented in the House of Commons. The Scottish Nationalists, the Welsh Nationalists, the Irish Nationalists, and there's a meaningful third party, which your notes points out have been called many things: the Liberal Democrats, the Social Democrats, the Alliance, the Liberals. The one thing you should know about why both parties or why both the United States and Great Britain has two dominant parties is the single member plurality system. Look at your notes on that. The single member plurality system really rewards the two largest parties, because in both the United States and Britain, it is not just enough to be popular. You have to actually be the most popular in a constituency to actually win a seat in Congress or the Commons, and look to your notes for that. I will get into the House of Commons in the next mini lecture.